Um, so on our Kawakib webinars, I'm very happy and honored to have with us today Dr. Hugo Slim from Oxford University. Dr. Slim is an established academic in policy relations, particularly specializing in the ethics of war and humanitarian aid. He has authored a number of books, including Humanitarian Ethics, A Guide to the Morality of Aid in War and Disaster, a book that I basically fell in love with, and it was the beginning of my real work in this area. And it is often thought as an indispensable guide on the complex world of ethics and conflict and the moral quandaries confronting those engaged in humanitarian action and with vulnerable people. Particularly during these times, this talk is very important and timely. And I thank you, Dr. Hugo. I know how busy you are. Thank you for giving us time. And the floor is yours.
Talia, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. And it's lovely to be with people from the American University of Beirut. I was very lucky to go there once, several years ago, and I was given a tour of the university by my former ICRC colleague, Basma Tabaja. And I thought it was beautiful. And I noticed, of course, that you have a wonderful building there by the great architect Zaha Hadid. And we have one by her in Oxford too, at St. Antony's College. But I think yours is nicer and more beautiful. So it's lovely to think of you all there. I should start with two clarifications. The first is a Lebanese clarification, because I am not a Lebanese Slim. So sadly, I am not related to Carlos Slim and that family. Otherwise, I would give you lots of money for research immediately. But I do have a Lebanese connection, because my grandfather was a man called Spinney. And he went out in World War I to fight in your part of the world. And he stayed on because he liked it. And he opened some shops called Spinney's.
Oh.
And so I do have Lebanese connections, but it's not Slim. So
that's interesting, Hugo, because we do shop from Spinney's. It's a small world, isn't it? Yeah.
Good. That's lovely. And then the other thing I wanted to say is an academic clarification as well, because I'm not an expert on shame, except, of course, from my personal experience of being ashamed quite often in my life. And so I'm going to say that Talia made me do it. And of course, that is a classic shame-based response, because we often, when we feel ashamed, we blame someone else and say, they made me do it. But she did. So anyway, I'm delighted to do it. And here we go. And it's a vital question. Does shame work to increase respect for IHL and the Geneva Conventions? And it's vital because, for several reasons. First of all, there's a big assumption still that naming and shaming and blaming people for violations, and these days being outraged all the time, that these business of shaming violators and shaming people who are not doing anything to stop violators, like other governments, the assumption is that still works because people are doing it every day, all the time. And the other reason is behavioral science is now a powerful influence on policy, and it cautions us against shaming. So it encourages instead a more appreciative approach, emphasizing what is good, emphasizing where people are respecting IHL and calling people towards good things, not shaming them for bad things. And of course, we live in a mental health age at the moment as well, in which we must all be sort of emotionally out in some way, expressing our feelings, showing our feelings, and not holding them close. And therefore, we're expected to confess our shame and respond to it. That is an increasingly predominant culture. And of course, a mental health culture, which we also understand that people really do the work. If they do the mental and emotional work on themselves, they can change. And so it's okay to be ashamed if you change. So this sort of background affects the way we look at shame and use it and in our societies today around war and everything else. I'm going to try and answer three questions in this talk. What is shame? So we all have a common sense of what we're talking about. How does shame play at the strategic leadership level around IHL violations? How do presidents, prime ministers, generals feel ashamed, not feel ashamed? And then thirdly, how does shame play at the individual, personal, small group level of men and women at the front line of conflict as combatants? So what is shame? What is shame at the strategic level, and does it work? And what is shame at the very personal individual level, and does it work? Can you hear me?
Pardon me to interrupt. Yes, yeah. But pardon me to interrupt. Some of our colleagues might not be aware of what IHL or the Geneva Conventions are. So if you can say a few words.
The Geneva Conventions are the laws of war, and they are international treaties governing what is right and wrong in war. And altogether, they are called International Humanitarian Law, IHL. So if you hear me say IHL, I mean the laws of war. So thank you, Talia, for that. So let me start by thinking about what is shame. And it's a really appropriate topic for a bioethics program because shame is bioethical. It is one of the most famous examples of how we biologically express an ethical sense. And when we feel morally wrong or ashamed, we blush. We put our eyes down, we look away. So it is one of the rare ethical things which we physically express immediately. And we feel we have done something wrong in that process. And shame hurts and is uncomfortable. And it's potentially deadly and disastrous because, as we know, many people who feel truly shamed may commit suicide. And many people who feel they've been ashamed by another person may kill that other person, as in honor killings and things like this. So we can talk about shame being a really moral emotion. And we can also talk about it as a social emotion because shame is socially constructed by a group and imposed by that group on individuals and other groups. So it's a moral emotion and a social emotion. And shame always follows a judgment of some kind. We are judged and we are found to be either weak or wicked or failed in some way. And as the great, amazing Ernest Goffman said, shame is also really then about identity. And shame means we have a spoiled identity. And shame is linked to honor. It is also transferable. I can be shamed and dishonored by the actions of another person, a family member or a fellow warrior. And so shame is contagious, if you like, and it spreads. You could talk about an epidemiology of shame. You could talk about one person shaming the whole regiment, or one person shaming the whole family or the whole company or the whole university. The other thing about shame is it can have various chronologies. So shame can be felt immediately. When I do something that I realize or I'm told is wrong, I feel shame immediately. And shame can also be felt many years later, long after you've done something. There are things in my life which I didn't think particularly shameful at the time, but now, years later, I see them differently and I feel ashamed about them. And also shame can last for a while and then be repaired in some way, or shame can last forever. And most importantly, I suppose, for our conversation today, shame can make us less violent or more violent, because shame can make us retreat or shame can make us attack. Because it is so closely linked to humiliation. And humiliation, for each of us, is a terrible thing. It means we are brought very low. and feel despised. And this humiliation is something we are forced to endure. So we might just endure that humiliation, or we might rise up and resist it and fight against shame and humiliation. And many conflicts are rooted in a sense of shame and fighting back to overcome that humiliation. There are other ways of dealing with shame too, most obviously religious, spiritual ideas, moral ideas of repentance, reparation, forgiveness, changed behavior, and then reintegration into society. And we've seen a lot of this, talked about a lot in northern Uganda, particularly after the war there, rituals of repentance, forgiveness, reintegration. The last thing about shame that's very important is that it always leaves a mark or a stain. And something of shame is always carried by a person or by a people. It's carried in sadness or in regret, or more positively, shame is carried in triumph as something that has been overcome. I think also, before we talk about shame and respect for the laws of war, we might remember particularly and think about three types of shame that people talk about. One is unwanted exposure. So shame is really unwanted exposure. I didn't want the spotlight put on what I'm doing. And then I'm shamed because of that exposure. Shame is also related, as we said, to falling short and failing in some way. And shame is also understood as exclusion and stigma, being sent away and stigmatized with a mark in some way that you are a failure in some way. So that's a brief introduction, I hope, to shame as a very profound and old human bioethical reality for all of us. Now I want to look at how does shame play out at the strategic level around respect for the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions. Is the risk of shame a form of restraint in war? Does it inhibit violent decisions made by presidents, generals, air marshals, and armed group leaders and their commanders? Does shame have a real place in strategic level war making about decisions to kill, to not kill, to destroy, to not destroy? I'm not optimistic here at this strategic level. And I think sometimes shame can restrain breaches of the laws of war, and sometimes it just doesn't and can't. And let me explain why. I think, in effect, it depends in reality. And it depends on a leadership's political interests and on the ethical frame and ethical culture in which leaders shape their war and their struggle. So if fighting a war while respecting the rules of war is in the political interests of a leadership, then they will want to play by the rules of war and stay in the respectable club as proud members of that club. They will obey the rules because it's in their interests. If they feel the world is watching and the world around them wants them to win with respect for the rules of war by fighting ethically and well, and it's important to their victory and their respect, then they will do that. If they're trying to persuade a population that they're conquering or trying to win a counterinsurgency against or an insurgency, if they are trying to persuade that population that they are better people than the alternative power, then it's probably in their political interests to be kinder and fight more ethically in line with the laws of war. And in recent years, if we look at Western military forces, American, US, European, and Australians recently, and their political leaders, they've had many hard political interests and reasons why they should respect IHL as the ethical frame of their fight. Very often the prevailing moral mood around their citizens, their electors, their families, their cultures, coincide with hard political interests. And if they were then to ignore the laws of war and fight absolutely ruthlessly, they would be shamed by their societies, and they would be excluded and have a stain upon them. A military ethical culture which currently values the laws of war as honourable and ethical will take breaches very seriously, and it would mean that individual soldiers and big generals and leaders would be shamed. So this all means that shame has power to restrain violence and encourage respect for the law when an important part of winning well is respecting IHL. But interestingly, when militaries do have this belief that they need to win within the rules, they often don't talk about shame. They talk about the opposite of shame, which is pride. So they talk all the time about their pride as an armed force, that we are fighting with great pride in the humanitarian values we all hold dear, and these values make us who we are. So that's the way you'll hear American, European, NATO troops talking when they say we are fighting within IHL. Not because we're ashamed if we don't, but because we're proud that we are that kind of good person. And interestingly, as behavioral scientists always tell us, a positive call to do something because it's good is always better than a negative call to stop doing something because it's bad. But the other reason I'm not optimistic is because interests in war, political interests and objectives, and the ethical frames and ethical cultures in war can change. Western democratic leaders have in the past been extremely brutal in wars, and they could easily be so again, depending on how they see the war and the ethical frame around it. So depending on the stakes in a war and the ethical frame they choose to describe their military action, the virtue and the pride in respecting the laws of war could lose its moral logic and its personal appeal to leaders. And this is clearly what happens in many conflicts in which leaders see no strategic interest in respecting the laws of war. And they develop a totally different ethical frame as the moral logic of their fight. And in this ethical frame, they feel no shame about breaking the laws of war. So let me explain that. Many leaders make the case that the reasons they must win the war are so important that they must pursue extreme measures, or they and their followers and leaders and citizens will face oblivion. So instead of describing war as something that should contain a humanitarian element, they reframe their struggle as absolute, and they convince people that it is right to be extremely severe and extremely violent. So then we hear a discourse and a talk like this. These people must be stopped or wiped out, and they must get what they deserve, or we ourselves and all we stand for will be obliterated. And you probably hear this a lot in the Middle East at the moment and around you. And we've heard it a lot in Europe many times in our history. And you hear things like the distinctions of the laws of war are not a luxury we can afford. To be heroic in our war, in our fight, means to be ruthless and to show no compassion. It is God's will, and we have God on our side to fight like this. So in a different moral frame, when you judge the war to be so important that you're facing annihilation, you can find different ways of arguing that do not need the laws of war at all. And this kind of thinking and talking reframes the moral logic of a fight. It makes compassion and humanity shameful. Compassion and humanity shameful, not ruthlessness and violence. It makes ruthlessness and hard violence something to be proud of because the ends justify these means. And if this moral framing or this moral reframing is socially effective, then shame and pride around the laws of war are totally reversed. People may feel private shame many years later when the world has changed about what they did in that war, but shame around the laws of war will not be a majority restraint in the present. And it's right to say of these kinds of strategists and leaders that they know no shame in the light of the Geneva Conventions and IHL. They will not be made to feel shame by their opponents or by the advocates of IHL. And some people then say, well, if they're not going to be able to feel shame because of the morality of the law, can we shame them around issues of prestige and reputation and legitimacy? Maybe we can try and use that shame of exclusion, where we don't let them come to our meetings at the UN, we don't let them come to our meetings at the Arab League, we try and exclude them and shame them, and we deprive them of prestige as a state or a government or a military general. Would that work? Would that begin to shame them into action? And in truth, it usually does not. Sometimes it can. Sometimes with armed groups and governments who now are ready, they need legitimacy of allies, they will be shamed into changing their behavior. But in most wars, particularly if you have a very powerful ally, a great power, an America or a Russia or a China, they can't be shamed because they're so powerful anyway. So you are usually protected from risks of reputation and prestige. I just want to add two other psychological steps that leaders can take to fend off shame, to prevent shame. And these are denial and deflection, both of which work really well in today's informational age. So with denial, I can deny I did things. Denial is seemingly all too easy. You can use what they call false flags to blame the other side for some atrocity. You can just keep everything really secret. Thousands of people in detention, starving, whatever. Keep it secret. Or on social media, you can use social media to confuse, to compromise, to challenge the details of events, to obfuscate and deny it was you. Any claims that come against you, whether they're chemical attacks or deliberate bombing of humanitarians or numbers of people killed by drone warfare. So denial is a very powerful process. And it's particularly powerful because, and we probably all know this a bit from our lives, because just as you make others believe an alternative truth, you come to believe it too, emotionally at least. So your conscience is clear. You're not ashamed because you know it wasn't really you, even though it was you. You believe the denial. And we lie elaborately as a species, as humans, and we lie a lot to protect ourselves from shame. And our lying can work for a very long time. The second psychological step leaders and at the strategic level people can play is part of denial. It's to reflect the shame back onto your opponents. And so you don't just say that you did it and you deny that you did it. You don't say that you did it, not me. You actually say something a bit more complicated. You say, they made me do it. I am their victim and these are their victims, the ones I have hurt. They are ultimately responsible because they left me no choice. So that kind of deflection, where you deflect the shame like a mirror back onto the other side and saying, you left me no choice, this is your responsibility, is very common as well, and means people don't have shame because they don't believe that even though they did these things, it's not their fault ultimately. So at the strategic level, shame will work only when the laws of war are really important in the struggle. To keep them is really important. If a conflict and violence and war is framed beyond the laws of war and it ignores those laws and it talks about the need for absolute survival and great severity against an enemy, then these rules in the Geneva Conventions may themselves become shameful. And pride will be found in ruthlessness, in cruelty, and heroism will be found in great acts of severity. So that's my thought about strategic level shaming. I'm not very optimistic about it. So if we look now, how does shame play at the individual or small group combatant level? This is our third question. What about the individual soldier or air crew, the rebel or the jihadist working in intimate fighting groups of people, 10, 12, 20, whatever? If strategic shame avoidance is possible for leaders, if they can avoid shame, is it also possible for those who pull the trigger, press the button, or thrust the knife, who actually do the business of killing? Is it possible for them to avoid shame as well? Perhaps shame avoidance is easier in a presidential palace or a military headquarters than face-to-face with enemy people at the front line. And again, I'm afraid I think the answer must be yes and no. Because if the leadership's strategic, ethical reframing of the war as a struggle that must be beyond the laws of war because it's so important, if this is successful, then a majority of a leader's fighting forces can be expected to believe the moral logic of a ruthless war fought in an absolute and great cause. So most of the forces, the individual men, women, will buy into, ethically, emotionally, this narrative, and they will frame their orders and their actions as necessary, right, and even admirable. They will morally agree with their leader that there is no shame in barrel bombing or besieging or raping or starving and torturing and killing indiscriminately. But doing it in practice is probably still morally hard for the majority of people. Groups of fighting men and women who've been formed and normed earlier together in a different moral frame may well resist this new moral logic. They may also reach certain moral understandings with communities in which they're fighting and against which they are fighting that defy the moral logic coming from above. And here the ICRC's report on the roots of restraint in war is very interesting. It shows clearly that combatant ethics do not only come vertical and top down from above, from commanders and presidents. These ethical norms are also formed horizontally between soldiers as they fight and between soldiers and civilian communities with which and in which they are fighting. So this should give us encouragement because it shows that an element of humanitarian resistance to military hierarchy is possible in a sort of everyday ethics that operates in particular situations between individual platoons and companies of soldiers and their enemies and populations around them. So we may then think military hierarchy is not the only or perhaps the main source of ethical authority in an armed force. Platoons and companies of soldiers and civilian communities make their own ethics too, and these might well be more respectful of the laws of war and kinder and more compassionate face to face. But if they agree together not to deliberately kill civilians and rape and steal, do they do this because they're ashamed? Maybe, but they may just do it because they think it's the right thing to do and it's who they are. So they may not wait to be ashamed to operate that kind of humanitarian ethic. Sadly, I think strategically, however, humanitarians cannot be overly optimistic about widespread and locally generated ethics to shape a more respectful ethical fight. Realistically, it will not have the power to change the whole war in favor of the laws of war. And I say this because ruthless leaders know very well that the most ruthless actions of their war must be carried out by special teams of especially brutal people. Every terrible military has special units comprised of the most fervent believers in the war and the severity of the war. And it has hand-picked sociopaths whose brutality sets the tone of the fight and whose actions achieve critical mass for the ruthless moral logic agreed by its shameless leaders. So these people are deliberately recruited and specialized. They will never feel shame. And we can look at the history of war and see people in the SS and Gestapo in Nazism and in the genocidal people who led the Rwandan genocide. We can see it in Liberia and Sierra Leone, in Bosnia, the formation of these groups, and no doubt in Syria and Yemen as well, and Iraq and in IS. These groups, they particularly recruit to do the most of the terrible things. So no matter how ethically better general soldiers can become, you only need a few of those special units to be completely shameless about the rules of war. Finally, and then I'm going to end, I'm sorry, I've talked a lot, on a more hopeful note is the phenomenon we might call of delayed shame and creative shame. In the years following almost every war, people reflect on their actions over time. And among them, particular individuals often emerge who feel shame and feel an urgent need to convert their shame into peace activism and the prevention of such things ever happening again. The experience of their war, its shame and its regret, makes them into champions of peace who seek out reconciliation with their former enemies, and they talk urgently to the next generation about the need to avoid war's cruelty. These people, if you like, work as we might say alchemists of their shame. They try and change their shame into the gold of peace, and they channel it into a life as evangelists for humanity and peace. And several people like this who had seen firsthand experience in wars, in the Second World War, in the American War in Vietnam, and on both sides of these wars, several people like that played an important role in the drafting and agreement of the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. And we might therefore say that the laws of war themselves are born of shame as well as hope, and that shame therefore is creative in the construction of norms to restrain war. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you. I've tried to show and think a bit about what is shame. I've tried to think about shame at the resistance, at the strategic leadership level, shame at the local fighting level, and the alchemy of delayed shame. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugo. It's a very inspiring talk, and particularly closing with the idea that the laws of war have been made or developed by shame is quite optimistic and inspirational. Allow me to abuse, if I may, my place as host and ask 2 questions, and then we'll leave the floor to our colleagues if that is okay with you. So my first question pertains to my personal experience, having worked with the ICRC and the CDC on the development of the war, and traveled as an ICRC IHL ambassador and trained to different parts of the globe to disseminate them. I often feel I am a victim of a form of mental hypocrisy when I look back at those days, since we continue to see breaches of these laws with no accountability whatsoever. Typical examples would be raiding civilians, hospitals, medics, places of worship, and others. And we've experienced this in Lebanon during the war as well. So my question at this point is, how useful are laws to which no one is accountable? And what can be done about them, about this? So that's the first question. Do you want me to go with the second or wait for your answer?
Go with the second.
Okay, so the second is about naming and shaming, which is a central tool for human rights advocacy, particularly if advocates dare to raise reputational costs of bad behavior. By disclosing individuals, if you wish, armed groups, governments, or corporations who are breaking the rules or highlighting the devastating impact of their actions. So do you see this as a form of moral courage? And do you think that the benefits of shaming outweigh the risks? Some people might look at them as whistleblowers, and I don't like the term much, but oftentimes they end up by being punished. What are your thoughts on this? And thank you very much.
Tanya, thank you. Those are both questions which just cut straight to the bone of the issue. On your mental hypocrisy, and of course I've lived this for 5 years too when I was at ICRC, how useful are these laws really if they are being so badly violated? And I think there's 2 answers to that. I mean, the first one, we must not get mesmerized by the violations. We must also, and this is the spirit of appreciative inquiry, not just looking for failure, but looking for success, we must also try very hard to focus on where it is working. And in a sense, every time a convoy of food gets through to a besieged area, every time medicines reach people so they can be cured of sickness and injuries during war, that is a success of the laws of war. So one way is to say these laws don't stop the worst things happening, but they do stop many other things happening. So wars would be even more terrible without them. And I think that's the only answer I can give to that question, that yes, I think these laws are routinely and terribly broken. And I fear, because I'm not an optimist about human nature, I fear they will continue to be so. So we have to think, well, it's better with them than without them. And at least we have them working in some ways. So that's the only answer I can give you to that question. On naming and shaming, yes, I think it is usually an act of profound moral courage when people speak out, when they speak the truth of what has been done to their community, to their family, to their people, and challenge the lies and secrecy and denial of much greater powers. That's an extraordinary act of moral courage. And I think we have to recognize those people are extremely brave because many of them do suffer. I think it's still courage, not foolishness, because I still think that if they feel they really must speak and that somehow it may make a difference even to one life, or just the truth itself is important, then that is courage. And I think it has to be respected and encouraged.
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you very much. I'll leave the floor to my colleagues. I think we have a question from Dr. Wajiha. Dr. Wajiha, please.
Yes, Dr. Slim, thank you so much for that enlightening lecture. While you were speaking, I just kept thinking about a few days ago and honestly the attack on the Capitol building. And how do you think social media is affecting the narrative being told or the truth being sold to people? Because it seems to me as if it's obliterating the whole concept of shame at all, or like shame does not exist anymore. It seems to me like things that were in the past seemed completely unacceptable are now totally acceptable. I just wanted to see, like, get your thoughts on that if possible.
Yeah. And I don't think my thoughts are any greater than yours are, Wijia, and thanks for the question. But I think that would go back to my point that there are lots of people that you would expect to be ashamed, and they are not, because they have reframed the truth of the situation and the moral importance of their fight. So they truly believe either that the election was not stolen or that it was stolen, and that is so important that they must take different kinds of action, impeachment, or further attacks. And I think it's a huge problem because people can't agree on what really happened and what is really important. And they are, in my view, often being misled. My view would be that President Trump is misleading them, and he is reframing the truth and framing the struggle in such a way that they can behave in ways they would not normally do, because that's right in this case. So he is, in my view, being an appalling leader and a bad leader. So that's why people don't feel ashamed, because it depends what you believe and what you think is right and legitimate. And truth is hard to find in that situation when people are so determinedly lying and denying and counterblasting, and it's very hard.
Thank you. It's difficult. No.
Hello, I can't hear a question yet.
If the connection is too poor, perhaps the question can be written in the chat, and then we can read it.
Could I ask a question in the meantime? Okay, good evening.
Yeah, I think I can hear you, Malik.
Okay, thank you for the seminar. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask a question. It's based on when you differentiated the 3 types of shame at the beginning. I was thinking of the 2 different categories actually of shame. One which is a kind of extrinsic and one which is intrinsic, in the sense that the extrinsic shame would be one that we feel because we are being shamed, because we're being shamed by our constituents or other people, even though we may not be actually convinced that this is something shameful, versus when we, because of our moral code or values, are ashamed of something that we did. Can we think of it in that sense, or shouldn't we use the word shame? We should use something as guilt, etc. What do you think?
That's an interesting point, and I think your distinction between extrinsic shame and intrinsic shame is interesting and helpful, because, as I said, shame is usually imposed from outside because it's based on a social norm constructed by a group or a society that says this is shameful. So it makes sense to talk about that. But there is possibility that a person could feel intrinsically shamed by something that is not considered shameful in wider society, and it tortures them. And they needn't feel bad as far as society is concerned, but they do nonetheless because of an intrinsic sense of conscience and shame. And I suppose that the opposite that you're describing can happen too, that a person may not feel shame at all about something, but because the extrinsic pressure is so much, then they have to accept, okay, I've got to play as if I'm ashamed. And I think that must happen a lot. So I think you're absolutely right. So then you basically have no choice, or the best approach is to pretend shame to get the outcome you want, which might be just people stopping criticizing you or being reintegrated back in society or whatever. So I think that's a very good point, that a lot of people just pretend they feel shame to find an advantage.
Yes, I mean, I feel that we see that a lot of times with psychopaths or sociopaths when they do the type of killings or rapes or people would consider inhumane.
I've certainly done it a lot. I've spent my childhood in these rather severe English schools, and I've certainly pretended, oh, I'm terribly sorry, and that was an appalling thing to do, etc., when I know it wasn't at all, and I just want to get to the next stage. So, yeah, I think we all do that. It's a good point.
Thank you.
I can hear you.
Well, we can't hear you. Maybe would you mind typing the question? And then Miss Mikati can kindly read it, since she's the boss, the maestro. So in the meantime, let me fill the gap and ask Hugo one more question. Well, of course, it all depends on your view of human nature, and I understand it's not that optimistic, and perhaps rightly so. Is there anything we can do to undo the sense of pride in doing the wrong things, including killing and raping and what have you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I am actually, I don't mean I'm pessimistic about human nature. I'm just not optimistic that it will get totally better, as it were. So I'm optimistic that we will go on having as much good and as much bad as we have at the moment. And it changes and goes up and down, but there is always, in my view, and eventually enough good in the world. So I'm ultimately an optimist. What can we do about people who have pride in wrongdoing? It depends how much time you've got, really, doesn't it, to work with them about it? Because, psychologically, behavioralists, ethically, morally, religious people would say, well, if we can work with them enough, we can really open their eyes to what they're doing, that might help. But of course, if you're trying to stop them doing it again tomorrow in a war and trying to stop them bombing a civilian area deliberately again the next day, you don't have that time. So that's why, war is still policy in politics, because people think, well, we haven't got time to talk about it and see if they change and have a great epiphany. We should hit them back and stop them doing it. And that's all we've got time for at the moment, to stop them. So I think it's difficult. If you've got a lot of time, it might work. But as Malak said, if they're psychopaths or sociopaths, it's probably not going to work. And if they're really convinced about their cause, it's not going to work either. If they are real believers, in a way, a Islamic State person or a British imperialist, a white supremacist might be. So I think it depends on how much time you've got and whether you can be bothered, probably.
All right, thank you very much. Wadad, we have Wadad Hos with us who wants to share something. Can you try again, please, Mrs. Hos?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Clear.
Wadad, I can always hear you when you say, "Can I hear you?" But then when you start talking, I can't hear you. It's rather... Yeah.
Can you try logging 4G or changing your place to where the router is closer, for example? Please, we're eager to hear your comment. In the meantime, again, I'll fill the gap unless someone else wants to ask something and ask Hugo his opinion as to whether something can be done at the level of the educational institutions from early on, not necessarily college level or university level.
Is that a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you think this is possible? Okay, we have good.
Wadad, I'm afraid I...
Yeah,
I got...
I can't. I couldn't hear anything. Excuse me. Sorry to interrupt, but the sound I think is really really bad. And Dr. Slim, were you able to hear any? No, I only caught a few words, unfortunately.
I'm told by Mrs. Hoss via WhatsApp that she will be changing her location and trying again. But what I understood is she was sharing her personal experience during the Lebanese war. And I guess she will comment later. And someone she knows there was an attempted murder at someone she knows, she is related to. And that was a serial killer, actually. And ages later, he went to the person he tried to assassinate, kissed his hand and apologized. the apology was accepted, and he actually wrote a book about his crimes, and he has now an NGO educating people about the atrocities of crimes and how people can be brainwashed. And this book is available in Lebanon in Arabic. I wish it was translated. If it is translated, then I'll send you a copy, Hugo. We have Wadad back with us.
Yeah. Yes, you summed it up very well. That's it. So this is a person I know who actually crimes.
Thank you, Wada. That's a powerful story, and I think it does illustrate what I was saying about the sort of delayed phenomenon of creative shame, and many years later. And I do believe it happens in many, many wars and in many situations, and it's very good that it does, but it happens too late for the war in question or the murder in question.
Thank you. Any other question? We took a lot of time from Dr. Slim, and any other questions, since we have his very insightful comments and thoughts?
I had a question, if that's okay.
Of course, Diana. Hello.
Since I think a lot of our audience members are in the healthcare field, I was just wondering, when it comes to healthcare workers and who in times of war can be obviously on the front line, and first responders who find themselves in the middle of the chaos and such situations. I mean, isn't it more tricky for them when it comes to these moral questions and how they have to remove themselves from the context and everything going around them? So how would you go about I don't know, like instructing or like advising healthcare workers on how to deal with the shame or lack of that is in dealing with the atrocities of war, and balancing between their obligation and what they're to treat people and what they are faced with?
It's a really good question, Diana, and of course it affects, as you say, so many millions, well, thousands, millions of people who are health workers or humanitarians or teachers or whatever, who end up face to face with people they know have done terrible things, and they don't see any shame or regret, and they may see pride and celebration in it. And how should they react? And of course, the humanitarian ethic says that you must treat everybody, because they are alive, equally. It doesn't work on a justice basis by saying you should work with people on the basis of what they deserve as justice for what they have done. And that's very, very difficult. So you're really asking what happens when you feel a sense of disgust, moral disgust, at the person in front of you in a clinic, in a hospital bed, in a classroom, etc. And it's very, very difficult, and it creates a lot of moral stress for people who feel they must do the right thing and treat everybody equally when they know that that person did not treat everybody humanely. And it's just a profound challenge and part of the job, and people find different ways of coping with it. Some people don't cope with it, and it's very hard, but you're absolutely right to identify it as a core challenge, the sort of disgust at shamelessness.
I guess that's why admission criteria to medical school should include an assessment of the character of the applicant, because, as Aristotle said, you cannot teach a stone to fly upwards. Any other questions before we thank our professor? Hugo, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope this COVID-19 will dissipate and the many turbulences in this globe, and we will see you soon at AUB.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for listening. And Natalia, lovely to see you and be on this seminar.
Same here. Same here. We'll keep in touch. Thanks a lot, Hugo. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.